So this morning, we've kind of subdivided the remaining 18 verses or so. We finished up a fortnight ago in verse 34 of Acts chapter 7. Today we are covering 35 to 43. 35 to 43. Sure. So, and then we'll cover the remainder of Stephen's speech from 44 to 53 in the next session, and then the closing of that chapter from 54 to 60 the week after that. So, let me read the passage in full. We'll then pray, and then we'll commence our study from there. So, Acts chapter 7, verses 35 to 43. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt, and at the Red Sea, and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, "God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers." This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai, and with our fathers. He received living oracles to give to us. Our fathers refused to obey him, but instead thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, "Make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." And they made a calf in those days, and offered a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. But God turned away, and gave them over to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets, "Did you bring to me slain beasts and sacrifices during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You took up the tent of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship, and I will send you into exile beyond Babylon." Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read them, mark them, learn them, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So, here Stephen is continuing his, historical indictment against the wicked and perverse generation to whom he is speaking, not only in isolation, but in comparing them to their ancestors before them, who in many cases and oftentimes would be rejecting those who were sent to them, rejecting the prophets that were sent to them, as the wording goes. And he had already begun talking about Moses by the time we got to last session's passage, and he's continuing that through here with this indictment of how the people rejected Moses. So let's go through from verse 35 and work our way through from there. So, verse 35. This Moses, whom they rejected, said, "Who made you?" So they said to this Moses, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" We quoted that in our last session. This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. It's not the only time when Moses is described in this fashion, right? But often the role of the patriarchs and of the prophets was on many levels. One, the mouthpiece of God, literally and figuratively. They were also messianic in the sense that they were calling God's people to salvation. They would, in these cases, especially with major marquee figures like Moses, they were a prefiguring. They were an archetype of the definite article Messiah, the Mashiach who would come, the Christ. And in many ways, Jesus is most comparable with Moses. Of any of the Old Testament figures outside of King David himself, Moses is most particularly the one with whom Christ is compared, and is in fact compared to in the Scriptures. A startlingly high proportion of the things that Jesus did and is detailed as having done throughout the Gospels are mirrored almost exactly and directly with that which was done in the days of Moses / Aaron / Joshua. Many of the baseline things that occurred in Jesus' life, like having to flee to Egypt under the persecution of Herod, the Herodian genocide, coming back out of Egypt afterwards, being baptized in the Jordan River, just as the people of Israel crossed over the Red Sea, went through the waters of baptism, and that crossing of the Red Sea is, by Paul and others, communicated as having been the baptism of the people. He then goes into the wilderness of Judea for 40 days to be tempted, just as the people wandered through the wilderness of Arabia for 40 years. All these various things. We could be here all day detailing the various ways in which this occurred, even ways that perhaps people will not connect often. Jesus' first miracle was the turning of water into wine at the wedding at Cana. Moses' first miracle was the turning of the Nile water into blood. Blood and wine being connected and symbolized most pointedly in that of communion. And that whole connection, right? So same miracles being done, symbolically referenced in that fashion. So Moses as the redeemer of the people, right? Ruler and redeemer, in this case, ruling by virtue of the fact that he is the one through whom God is speaking, he is the one through whom God is working, and he is and was ruler and redeemer to the people of Israel, just as Christ is to Israel, just as Christ is to his people. Their rejection here is again why Moses is being paralleled with Christ. Why here, in this case Stephen, is highlighting the people throughout history. We've gone through Abraham, now onto Moses, who were rejected by the people, right? And that statement there in verse 35 is kind of the thematic pretext for these verses that we're looking at this morning. He was rejected. Who made you a ruler and a judge? Well, God. But again, this was the God who had long been forgotten. The people had been enslaved in Egypt for 4 centuries, and it does not take 4 centuries to forget the old ways. It does not take even 40 years often to forget. During the days of the Babylonian exile, which was all of just 70 years, the generation that would have been born in Babylon, right, those children didn't speak Hebrew, didn't know Hebrew, never heard or read the scriptures. They were thoroughly taught and indoctrinated in Babylonian education, spoke the languages of Babylon and Arcadia, and all those various things. And so it doesn't take that long to strip a people of their identity, of their cultural heritage, their religious heritage and everything else. Kind of like we're going through now. And so that's the impetus for, by the time you get 400-ish years later, well, they don't recognize the God who has been calling Moses, in this case, to be sent to them as ruler and redeemer. And so in verse 36, we're then told that this man led them out, performing many wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. Right? And that is to say, the Exodus. Right? That whole event that we refer to as the Exodus. Again, we explained when it came up in previous chapters here in the book of Acts. This time around, Moses and Aaron was one of those staple times where miraculous signs and wonders were being done, right? The other major two being in the days of Elijah and Elisha, and then this time here with the advent of the new covenant, and the apostles and everything else here. And so there's many signs and wonders that were being done. Of course, famously the 10 plagues of Egypt, which were done for a variety of reasons. The foundation of which was to, as a very obvious apologetic and assault upon the gods of Egypt. All 10 of the plagues, I'm not going through it here obviously in detail, but all 10 of those plagues that were brought down directly counteracted the purported authority and powers of 10 of the different Egyptian pantheon, right? And so nevertheless, that is the purpose of why these signs and wonders were done, to show that no, in fact, it is the God of these slaves, the God of Israel, who is actually the one true God, who has all that power to do those signs and wonders in Egypt, to part the Red Sea, to wipe out the army of Egypt, to preserve them through the wilderness for 40 years. And so that's what's being referred to. And indeed, it was still this one who had led them through all this that they then rejected. And again, that's what Stephen is going into here as we progress through these verses. So in verse 37, this is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai with our fathers. There's an interesting word being used there. Verse 38, congregation in the wilderness. It's actually the Greek word ecclesia, which is where we get the word church. Yeah. So that's why you'll hear me sometimes refer to the church in the Old Testament. This is not the only place that it does it. But the concept of ecclesia, the congregation, the assembly, is used on a number of occasions in reference to the people in the Old Testament. That's why, again, historically speaking, the Christian, when doing theology biblically, shouldn't think of a massive kind of stark bifurcation between Old and New Covenant, as if New Covenant just completely got rid of the Old Covenant. It's the capstone that completes the Old Covenant. Right? The history doesn't just get magically overturned and now we got something brand new. Right? As people do that, they start to head down some pretty dangerous roads. Roads that people have gone down historically, because the end product of that are heresies like Marcionism, which believed and has believed historically, going all the way back to the first couple of centuries of the church, that in very simple terms, the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were two different gods, two different deities. There was the Old Testament, the ruthless, barbaric, evil demiurge, and then there was the new, nice, kind, loving, gracious God in the new. That's where you end up getting to when you take that to its absolute extremes, right? When you bifurcate, meaning to kind of divide into two, Old and New Testament, Old and New Covenant, that kind of thing. No, it's all the same history, right? Again, as Paul explains in Romans chapter 11, the Gentiles and I as Gentile have been grafted in to Israel, grafted in, one tree. There's only one tree presented in Romans 11, and it's a grafting in, right? And so, point being here that this term congregation in the wilderness is fantastic that Stephen uses that, because it shows that continuity of God's covenant people, of the redeemed people, right? And it's this Moses, right, who was the one in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our fathers. Now, the reference to angel speaking there could be taken of one or two ways, and probably actually could be taken both ways. You could either take this at a baseline level as just a generic reference to angel, right, and an angelic involvement in the delivering of that covenant and the 10 Commandments. And we do get reference to that. The author of Hebrews references it that way, kind of exactly the same way in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 2. And there would be others. I think there's another reference in Galatians 3 off memory. I'd have to find it. But anyway, you also, of course, have that reference that comes up about the angel of the Lord, which has been commonly understood to be a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ. And so it's probably both. in that element. It's not so much a matter of if or, but kind of both and. With the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai, because obviously when you go and read Exodus, it's Moses and God speaking. So whilst we're told elsewhere that there was indeed angelic involvement in that delivering of covenant and all of that whole process, the definite article angel here is probably that same kind of reference in a more fuller form of angel of the Lord, referencing to to pre-incarnate Christ. This angel who spoke with Moses at Mount Sinai and with our fathers, vis-a-vis Abraham bargaining with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, and a multitude of other kind of references. Jacob wrestling with the angel of the Lord, right? All these kinds of things, right? And this active involvement of, again, this is what the point of what Paul often describes as the mystery. But indeed, a lot of what the New Testament does is consummates and reveals a lot of things which were symbolically referenced, figuratively referenced as real things, but they were symbolically and figuratively pointing forward to something in the future, namely Christ. And a lot of the New Testament reveals what that is. It's kind of like so that's what that was. That's a lot of what happens in the New Testament. You got a question, Gossa?
You've just covered what I was going to say, but I might put it in a different sense.
Yeah, go for it.
We, of course, have the benefit of our Lord and Saviour who came, died, was resurrected.
Yes.
But Hebrews chapter 1 clearly gives us a window into their mindset. They were very much interested in angels.
Of course, yeah.
Because they didn't have the incarnate Christ.
Yeah.
They spent a lot of time pondering angels.
Yeah,
angelology.
And we don't. Yeah.
We don't.
Well, some do, and it can get a bit dangerous. But angelology, as it's referred to in modern English, is that field. And for those kinds of reasons, by virtue of the fact that yes, the most visible forms of messenger throughout the Old Testament was a prophet or an angel. That's essentially what it was. Especially by the time you start getting forward through to the times kind of post Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, post Moses, now from kind of especially, time of David, so 1000 BC onward. You're now 1,000 years beyond the days of the patriarchs like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You're 500 plus years to 1,000 years by the time you get to the Babylonian exile, beyond the days of Moses and all those kinds of things. So there's a distance of time there, where those stories you hear of, of the angel rescuing Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, and those kinds of various things seem distant from their perspective, because it would be like us going back to, the high medieval age 1,000 years ago kind of thing. It's that same kind of time difference, yeah.
I think it's also a good idea to have mercy or be
gracious,
rather sympathetic and gracious to the Old Testament saints and the people living at around the time of Jesus and at the time of Jesus, because they really struggled with who he was. They weren't expecting the Son of God. It didn't mean anything to them. The highest they put him at was prophet. Remember, Jesus said to the disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" And the disciples answered, "A prophet." Yep. They just couldn't get it into their heads.
Correct, yeah.
Look at these days. We're back. They can't get it into their heads that Jesus is the Son of God. So the people around the time of Jesus struggled with the very same thing that the modern people are struggling with. And Jesus said to Peter, God has opened your eyes to say that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, very good point. Yeah, it's
But in the old days, they also were very aware of God, whereas these days they want to pretend God doesn't exist.
Yeah, true.
Was that true back then?
Yeah, it depends on the time period we're talking about. Like, there was always certainly a religious element. The most overt problems that go on, especially in it's not exactly 500 years, but I'm just going to call it roughly 500 years, from the days of Solomon to the end of the Babylonian exile. Let's just call that roughly 500. When you have the splitting of the kingdom into Israel and Judah, right? So in other words, northern kingdom, southern kingdom, going through the days of the major and the minor prophets. You have Jezebel, all the various kings, most of them bad, etc. The big issues was religious syncretism, as it's referred to, which is where you take your current religious framework and you mold into it other pagan elements, right? At the same time, a lot of what the books of the kings and the chronicles of the kings are detailing is kind of just flat out apostasy, where you could have for hundreds of years in the northern kingdom, which is what happened. You got the temple down in Jerusalem, but again, that's Judean territory. Up in the northern kingdom, beyond that, you have synagogue elements, but this is not like, you don't have access to the temple in Jerusalem, not like that, not on that level. And so you have, Ashtoreths, which are, worship trees to the Assyrian god Astarte, or Ishtar, on every corner. Right? You've got worship to Moloch, which is
So they were denying God.
Yeah, effectively. Yes, absolutely. They did very much forget. The defining reason that's given, it's not the only reason, but the overarching reason that's given for why the Babylonian exile was 70 years was because that was the accumulated time of how many Jubilee years had not been celebrated.
Yeah, that's right.
So, and that's 400 plus years worth by the time you go through and calculate it. So for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries, they had completely abandoned any recognition or upholding of the Jubilees. That's pretty forgetful, right? You know what I mean? So it's a forgetting of that and going off in other things. The difference, is there much of a substantive difference between that and this today? Not really. Like, it's not really. Like, it's only kind of prima facie. It's only on at face value, where we think that people are kind of, at least functionally speaking, atheistic or agnostic. They don't really know what they believe about. They don't really do. It's kind of a lackadaisical, don't really care about really. But they're not irreligious at all, like in any capacity whatsoever. They're actually profoundly religious, like deeply, and they're just as religious as anyone else in history. Their gods are money. Their gods are their status. Their gods are kind of just general hedonistic vices. Their gods are sports teams. Their gods are themselves, by virtue of as in like their own fame and renown, by virtue of social media. Their gods are insert a bunch of things. So it's nothing. It's the only thing that has changed is the names of gods on face value. That's really kind of it. They still undertake rituals just by different names. They still give devotions and adorations just by different names. Prayer you could maybe argue is a bit of a difference, although I really even wouldn't argue that much at all, because even the baseline concept of prayer in pagan societies in the ancient world were very much to do with placating, appeasing, and essentially like a wish list. Please do this, please don't do that, please do this, please don't do it, whatever the deal was. I fail to see how that's all that much different from people who just generally speaking, consult Woman's Weekly for their latest zodiac. Like, it's not, what's the difference here? Do you understand what's the difference? And so it's paganism, it's just a modern version of it, yeah.
They still have prayers.
Absolutely.
The people that I still sometimes associate with, they've just replaced the prayers that we know, the biblical prayers, with very small, nevertheless, prayers. They say things like, if the universe grants it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's a prayer.
100%. Yeah, yeah, exactly. The concept, the modern, yeah, exactly. The modern word of faith kind of concept of speaking it into existence. That's massive. That's humongous among just general secular people, where they do genuinely they adopt this. Well, it goes further back than this, but it's a very Nietzschean idea almost. Anyway. Of basically the will to power, the ability to will something into existence. Without being smart, fascists believed that. So Mussolini believed that. Nietzsche's concept of the will to power, which I know doesn't make sense to me just saying it, but this concept of your ability that your mind and your will is able to form and shape reality was a fundamental belief of the Italian fascists. There's also a fundamental belief, just in a different way, to the Nazis. And the ability to exert your will upon the universe. That's the result. That's what World War II is. It's that concept played out, and you see that in where people legitimately today, believe that if they go to enough seminars and do enough things, that they would be able to will themselves into wealth, into financial success, into getting that house, getting that car, getting that whatever it is you want to talk about. It's the exact same. It's no different.
Even saying two words which are common in the secular
Good luck.
world.
Good luck.
That's the most common one. But the more sinister one is when they say, and it's very common, touch wood.
Oh, yes.
What they're really doing is that's a little prayer.
Yeah, especially when they kind of mean it. Yeah.
If only they knew it was a prayer. It's a prayer to witchcraft, and it's really saying, if you expand on what it means, it's saying God's out there that I kind of know exists but I can't see.
Yeah, the spirits.
Would you please favour me with good fortune and keep away the bad luck?
Basically,
that's a prayer.
That's pretty much what it is. Yeah, and that's the baseline practice of paganism 101. Yeah, is belief in. That's what fairies are, for example. Fairies are not. We think of fairies like Disney Tinkerbell and stuff like that. Fairies were always in medieval time and elsewhere considered malevolent, not benevolent. The spirits of the woods and the spirits that resided, those kind of things. It's just it's 100% bona fide paganism. It's just simply by different standards and different outlooks. Like kind of surface level stuff, is still at its root level the fundamental. I'm saying there's Christ or there's paganism. There's no in between. There is this or there is anything else. It doesn't matter what form it takes. It's just simply, it doesn't really matter.
Some Christian, and you may know who he was,
sure.
Said that an evolutionist atheist has an amazing amount of belief.
Oh, absolutely.
More than a Christian.
They actually have. Yeah, they do. No, they do. They have blind faith. They actually have blind faith. They have blind faith in a process that they can't observe over the course of a time frame that they can't measure, that they've never witnessed, all under the guise of supposed scientific method, whose inherent principle is observability. Right. Exactly. You're correct. No, it's not a matter of evolutionary theory being like contentious. It's by definition anti-scientific. It's what's called mythiopia, which is just the correct philosophical or theological term for myth making. Mythiopia, the creation of mythos. Myth we often think of as being, in the atheistic or secular terms, as like purely untrue. That's not really what the term myth has meant historically. It can, but not really. But myth making is that, well, you need to have an alternative to explain your worldview. Your worldview to you is that there is no God, conveniently, except for the God of yourself in the mirror. And so you have to create an entire system around that to try and justify it. So of course you come up with a system where the entire universe was brought into existence by absolutely nothing. Single-celled organisms formed out of absolutely nothing for no reason whatsoever, with zero evidence that it's even possible in the first place. Belief that then those single-celled organisms evolved into multi-cell organisms, which evolved into more complicated organisms, which then eventually somehow managed to crawl out of the ocean and come up onto the land just by, again, but by what though? By what? By will. Like that I'm supposed to believe that somehow that primordial creatures willed themselves to come out of the ocean and not die on the beachhead, until somehow eventually some fish figured it out. Do you understand? It's not.
It's a joke, really.
It's absolute. It couldn't be more laughable if it possibly tried.
It's a conspiracy theory.
It's not even. It's beyond. It's actually beyond unbelievable.
Yeah.
Like it's actually beyond that very concept of unbelievability. It's laughable, and that's before we even begin to start actually talking about evidential bases for these ideas. How horrifically empty the record of any of this, even remotely ever having occurred, actually is. They can point you to 1,000 artistic impressions of what they think happened. They can give you all kinds of nice computer-generated graphs.
Yes.
And that's...
When you think of it, it's like in the garden, you will be as God.
Yeah.
If you eat this
That's a
fruit.
lie, isn't it?
Yeah.
And from then on, other gods have taken over into people's lives.
Yes.
And there's only one true God
Yeah.
Of course there is.
that must be exalted. But there's always other numerous gods because Satan delights in doing that. He
Yeah.
is,
Yeah,
he's
exactly.
at the base of it right from the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And you will always be a servant to something.
Yeah.
You will serve the one true God, or you will serve the gods of men, and they will enslave you. Those gods may be produced from your own heart, but it doesn't matter. You're a slave to something. You are a servant of someone or something. Doesn't matter what it is. In the sense that you can try and outrun that any which way you would like to. It's not going to happen. As Calvin once said, the human heart is but a factory of idols. That's what happens. So it's paganism, and it's the worship of foreign gods, just by simple different name. And so that details, in circling back to this, a lot of what the history of the Old Testament unfortunately was at many times. This is what Stephen is speaking to. So, verse 39. Our fathers refused to obey him, right? Our fathers, again referring to our ancestors, right? They refused to obey him being Moses, but instead thrust him aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt. The human heart is but a factory of idols, as I just said. In their hearts they turned to Egypt, right? So in their heart, again, the heart having always, across cultures and across times, being representative of the will and of desire, right? What you truly love, of course, obviously the heart being connected with love. In their hearts, they turned back to Egypt, right? They turned back to that which they had known. They turned back to that which was more comfortable, which was more familiar, which at least, intellectually, if not spiritually, provided comfort for them, purely by familiarization, right, or familiarity rather. And again, that reality of what he's just said there in one sentence, but he's speaking about chapters and chapters and chapters of the book of Exodus in reference to that one sentence. It speaks so poignantly to the human condition, right? You've just, speaking of the people of Israel, you've just witnessed. You've just undergone a massive escape from the most powerful, army the world had ever seen to that point. You get met with a do-or-die scenario at the beachhead of the Red Sea. You then see the Red Sea part before you. You then cross through the ocean floor and witness that most powerful army be destroyed and the Pharaoh, most powerful man on earth, wiped off the face of the earth. You witness this pillar, this cloud of fire and smoke that's been accompanying you in this most supernatural and, in one sense, mystical of fashions. Moses goes up a mountain for all of 5 minutes and you essentially wet the bed and go back and revert to pagan worship of the Egyptian gods. Do you understand?
It's amazing, really.
Do you understand? Right? Do you understand? It's not, and it's not meant to be a slight. Like it's not meant to be a slight. Like, oh, they're stupid. No, because everyone else here would have done it too. Doesn't justify it. It just explains it, lest we think ourselves as better. Because as a very brief aside, one of the great arrogances of modernism is the belief, essentially, the hubristic, prideful belief that evils that were committed in the past would never be committed by people as virtuous as us moderns. People can't wrap their heads around why people of the then Weimar Republic legitimately voted in the Nazi Party. There was dodgy stuff that went on with what the Nazis did to the communists and other people around that election, but that election was not fraudulent in the sense that, like, oh, the people really voted for this party, but they dodged the ballots. No, the ballots weren't dodged. No, the German people legitimately voted in the Nazi Party. They definitively wanted that overwhelmingly. And we look back and go, oh, how could they?
It's just a satanic deception, isn't it?
Satanic deception, yes, but of satanic deception of people who were very much willing and wanting that deception to come. Right? And before we get into the history of why World War II broke out, because you'd have to go all the way back to Napoleon to try and do that, World War II didn't just happen to happen. People in the modern day can't even reconcile, because of pride and arrogance and hubris, can't even think of, oh, how could people in the past have done? We murder millions of babies every year. What are you talking about? Well, because you justify it, well, just like they justified it, and just like they justified it, and just like they justified this, and just like they justified slavery, and just like they justified the Holocaust, and just like that, you're no different. You're no different. And so anyway, so in this case here, right, you've got them turning their hearts back to Egypt. They're going back to that which is familiar, because amidst all of this surface level chaos, which it is, that's a rough ride, right? You're being chased across eastern Egypt. You come to a point where you think, well, this is it. We're definitely going to die now. And then this miraculous event of the parting of the Red Sea occurs. You happen to escape, and now you're in the wilderness, literally the wilderness in Arabia, in a land you've never been to, that you only ever heard of as this, wild badlands out to the east. Can't go there. This would be a rough thing. So going back in their hearts to Egypt provided comfort, because it was familiar, because it was a safe space essentially for them, to use that modern term, right? And this idolatry was more comfortable to them. It was more comfortable, right? Spiritually and intellectually and otherwise, right? Purely by virtue of the fact that it was familiar. Again, that explains a lot of what you've seen over the last 2 years. Yes. Why on earth have people acted with such blind obedience? Yeah. Because centralized structures, no matter what their origins are, no matter how good or bad they suppose that, it provides comfort and security. And if there's one thing which human beings are absolute, unrivaled masters at, it is idolizing comfort and security. Comfort and security. Even if that comfort and security is lulling you straight towards the gates of hell, it's still comfort and security. and just rock-a-bye baby, off you go. Right? That's why I often say that a lot of people today are sleepwalking through history. Right? They're sleepwalking through history. Right? They're just being lulled to sleep. And this is what was going on here. Because humans desire comfort and security, that's why often people get referred to, as, even in biblical language, as sheep. Right? God's not being mean when he refers to his people as sheep, because this is sheep behaviour. Right? This is herd, timid, sheepish, literally, behaviour. Right? And so in that, in verse 40, what do they say to Aaron? Make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. Well, we told you, I'm going back up the mountain I'm paraphrasing obviously, but I'm going back up the mountain to meet with God.
I'll be back. I'll be back.
Right, I'll be back, right? They're probably witnessing this storm, they would 100% be, they're witnessing this violent storm going up the top of the mountain. And so again, they get scared. And but this is an unfamiliar land, we've just crossed this and it's been a journey, and go back, and we need to build an idol. Just reverting back to what's familiar, right? Make for us gods who will go before us, because they've already dropped what's in front of them and scurried on back to what was familiar, right? And they made a calf in those days. Right, and that's, again, he's shortening a lot of the books here, but again, Aaron takes all the gold and jewelry and stuff like that. Jewelry, they have melted down, fashions a golden calf idol. We can get into that imagery in a second. And offers a sacrifice to the idol, right? And they were rejoicing in the works of their hands, right? So they're having a worship service. And praising the idol and all this various stuff. As I'm saying, again, it seems so foreign to us, because a lot of times we fall for the modernist trap of looking back through history and going with this sanctimonious attitude of how could they have done that, right? As if for the last 2 years, a gigantic percentage of the church didn't just do the same thing, except under a different guise. One little click, one little glitch in the proverbial system of our society, and people dropped to their knees and went, "Please, Daddy Government, please save us from the scary virus. We'll do anything you want." We'll give up worshipping God. We'll give up our prayers. We'll give up our obedience to God. Just please get more power and give yourself more power by law and tell us what to do. But you can sit around and pretend that that's not what happened, but all you're doing is pretending. You can sit around and rationalise it any way you want, but you know who else sat around and rationalised it? These people. Everyone rationalised. It's not a slight. Like it's not. I don't say that with joy. It saddens me to say that. It's not a matter of. It doesn't come from anger either. It just comes from an honest assessment of reality. People, you can sit around and rationalise it all you want. It doesn't matter, because everyone, when they do these things, sits around and rationalises it, and always has a reason as to why their scenario is supposedly different. It's like, well, no, but it's different in this case. But everyone says that. Everyone says that. And that's the sadness of it, right? That's the heartbreak of it. Right? And that's why here he's pointing, again, they would have had justification in these days, right? The audience to whom Stephen is speaking to would have had, and does have, and we've heard plenty of them already, has 1,000 different reasons as to why they think they were justified in doing what they did. Right? The seminal one that was given at the crucifixion. We have no king but Caesar. Exactly. So that's their justification. That's their overarching justification, which they wouldn't. They're not imbeciles. They wouldn't have said that if they didn't believe. Of course, they believed that. It doesn't matter how much one can rationalize. It doesn't change the objective reality of what's going on, right? In this case, this is what he's referencing back to what happened in the days of Moses and of Aaron, right? And so in verse 42, but God turned away, rightfully, and gave them over to worship the host of heaven. God does that. The Bible is laden with examples of, and obviously I'm injecting some anthropomorphism here on my part, but it captures the very sentiment. There is a very long list of scenarios in the scriptures, Old and New Testament, right, but particularly Old, where God essentially says, "Okay, have it your way."
Yeah, like in Romans.
Okay, have it your way.
Yeah.
Now it's not really. It's ultimately still under His sovereignty, so it is still ultimately God's way. But in our human paraphrasing language, okay, have it your way.
I say that all the time to people. If that's what you want, you'll get it.
Yeah, right. It's not. Yeah, it's not. Exactly. And this is the thing about and this is why we think about questions like, oh well, God, does, how do we, the problem of evil, and other such issues, like questions about, well, what, like, if God is all good, why is there evil in the world, and such questions. There are deep philosophical questions, but baseline answers to those questions begin with the fact that an understanding of what God does in this scenario. God, when it uses this kind of language, right, in reference to this issue or any other issue that's along those lines, right, God turning away and giving them over to worship of idols, in this case the host of heaven. I'll explain what that means in a minute. That's not an active role in that sense. It's actually a passive one. By virtue of the fact, and here's what I mean by that, is that God does not actively make them go and worship this. He does not. He does nothing. He does not. He steps back. He doesn't have. He takes away any common grace by the Spirit, as we refer to in theology, right? Common grace, the kind of common grace that exists right now, where there's not a riot going on at Woolworths, right? Which is what would otherwise happen if the common grace of the Spirit of God was not active in the world, right? And that protection of God's common grace, as we refer to it as, right? Grace that goes out commonly to people, that stops them from completely becoming reprobate and just completely going down the spiral of where their hearts would otherwise lead them. Referred to as common grace theologically. When that gets removed, bad things happen. When that gets removed, terrible things happen. That is God doing nothing. Yeah. That's God passively sitting back and going, He's still sovereign over it.
Of course he is.
He hasn't lost authority. He's still in oversight. There's still sovereignty. There's still authority. All that kind of stuff. But he's all he does is let human beings be human beings, and that's what will occur. You get really vivid examples of that. One that comes to mind is that 7-year period where Nebuchadnezzar essentially becomes a beast or an animal, Nebuchadnezzar II. There's debate as to what exactly that means, but nevertheless, even at the most elementary level, it is him, in this case, exact kind of thing being turned over, right, to use the kind of words here, giving over to, like what Paul describes in Romans 1, giving over to a debased, sinful nature that is cursed by sin, and you end up acting and behaving like an animal and living with the animals and the beasts in the field for 7 years, which is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar II, as judgment against him.
It's happening again with... I shouldn't really raise this example because the ladies probably are not aware of it, but there are some people in...
Sure, go for it, yeah.
Particularly in the West, I mean, under the...
That goes elsewhere. Yeah, I know you're going with this, that's
craziness,
fine. Yeah.
Who are living their day-to-day lives as dogs.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they do.
Because it's a fetish. And they're living like dogs.
Yeah, they do, yeah. Yeah, you see that.
They eat out of a bowl, they've got dog masks.
Yeah, exactly. It's always in partner with someone, there's a sexual element. There's always a sexual element to it.
We're back.
Yeah, everything like that. And anything else like that always gets diagnosed in modern secular psychology as just simply what's referred to as paraphilia, which means para meaning other. which is just the nice sanitized language for just all kinds of different sexual perversions.
Make up a name for something.
Yeah, and so all those various things. And so again, it's not territory we haven't been in before. The world has been in this kind of territory plenty of times before. The West has been in this territory plenty before, but it's that rise and fall of what you're talking about there. Yeah. And that's what happens. It happened in the days, even the first century. It happened to Nero. Nero started off more or less like any other Roman emperor when he came to power in 54 AD. But by the time you get about 4 or 5 years in, he murders his wife and stepmother. That begins a spiral of a descent on Nero's part. By the time you then fast forward to he was actually assassinated because he got so bad that even the Romans assassinated him in 68. So he reigned for 14 years. This is just at the beginning of the Roman conquest of Judea. He was famous for he invented something called the Roman candle, which is where he would crucify a Christian and then set them on fire and use them as lights at garden parties. He would tie Christians up to a pole, strip them naked. He would then strip himself naked. He would put on an animal cloak, be it bear or wolf or leopard, and then essentially go into a frenzy and start eating the person alive, like tearing their flesh off and eating them cannibalistically. That gets into a whole kind of various things. So that's what happens. But you have to understand, though, that again, from a right understanding theologically, that's not inherently or necessarily, it can be, but it's not necessarily like some special curse. No, that is the human heart with God and common grace utterly removed. That's what it is. It's not some special thing. It's special circumstantially because God doesn't let every single person devolve to that level, right? And that's and again, you get that explanation throughout the New Testament, but that's his common grace. But when there's a turning over, there is something that really does occur where there is a removal to varying degrees, right? Because what happened in Nero wasn't the same as what happened here, but there is a turning over, a giving over to that of whatever you're doing in this case of this paganism. Here in this case in verse 42, they're worshipping the host of heaven. Host meaning, host of heaven referring to the stars. That's what the golden calf ultimately represented. I'll explain what that means here, right? And so as it was written in the book of the prophets, now it doesn't mention it here because they would have known where this came from. This is referring to Amos, where we get a reference in Amos 5, and I'll read that in a second. But here in Stephen's wording in verse 43, did you bring to me slain beasts and sacrifices during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? You took up the tent of Moloch and the star of your god Rephan, the images that you made to worship, and I will send you into exile beyond Babylon. Now, if you want to have a turn to Amos 5, which is where this is being quoted from, I'll read that. So Amos, again, one of the minor prophets. Contextually, Amos is a late contemporary of Isaiah. He's kind of the generation before Isaiah and would have had some overlap. Would have had some overlap when certainly at least when Isaiah was young, in terms of their lifespans. His main ministry was from about, roughly speaking, 760 to 755, roughly. So we're mid 8th century BC. Isaiah starts to pick up kind of 740. When was it in which week would it have been? Holiness of God. When we did Holiness of God a couple of weeks ago, we exegeted Isaiah 6 and Revelation 4. Yeah. In the year the King Uzziah died, I saw that was 740. Okay, and that's chapter 6, so it's relatively early on in the book, right? So we're in that mid 8th century, a number of prophets in the 8th century. Isaiah, one of them, there were others, again, Amos being one of them as well. So in Amos chapter 5, right at the end, verses 25-26, this again is an indictment against Israel for the various, again, this was heavy idolatry going on during these days. This is in the days of, it would have been King Jeroboam II, who, unless my memory serves me, if my memory serves me correctly, was struck down with leprosy. I believe it was Jeroboam II. I need to go back and check, but anyway, a series of bad kings in the 700s, in the 8th century, and this was also at the time of the height of the northern kingdom of Israel. They had conquered Syria, they'd conquered Lebanon, they'd conquered Moab, they'd conquered Ammon, they had conquered Damascus, which was obviously one of the most important cities in the ancient world, and this was the height of their power and of their territorial extent, and they were rife with pagan worship. Absolutely rife with it. They were very wealthy. Again, this is the apex of the northern kingdom, height of power, height of wealth, height of influence, and rife with pagan worship. So in verse 25-26 of Amos chapter 5, did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings during the 40 years in the wilderness, O house of Israel? That's the exact same wording. You shall take up Sikkuth your king and Kion your star god, your images that you made for yourself, and I will send you into exile beyond Damascus. So similar wording, but you notice some marquee differences. Babylon in Acts 7, Damascus here, Amos 5, Sikkuth your king, Moloch, then compared with Kion, your star god, compared to Rephan. Why is that the case? Again, as we've pointed out many times, if your level of biblical knowledge is just merely surface level, you will walk away thinking, oh no, this is a contradiction, the Bible must not be true. Fortunately, knowledge tends to resolve those issues. Being exiled beyond Damascus, well, what is beyond, from the perspective of Israel, what is beyond Damascus to the east? Well, that would be Babylon. Well, that would be not much, but that would be Babylon, right?
Yeah,
So again, Babylon, both synonymous with each other. The land beyond Damascus is Babylon. Right? Sikkuth your king and Kion your star god. Again, keeping in mind that Acts 7 is, so we got a New Testament quotation of the Old. Yeah. How's that being done? We've explained this before. They're never quoting from the Hebrew because they didn't read the Hebrew, right? They're quoting from the Septuagint. They're quoting from the Greek, right? So they're quoting from the Greek Old Testament, which was penned 3rd, 2nd century, and translated into Greek. And this was the operating version of what they knew and what they had. So how did that get translated across? Sikkuth, your king, Sikkuth, getting translated as Moloch, or appropriated in that fashion to Moloch, who obviously comes up a number of times, most famous in the Old Testament. Moloch was a Canaanite god who was responsible for different things. I'm not quite sure what he was responsible for in a really overt sense, like you had in other pantheons like Babylon and Greece and Egypt. But obviously child sacrifice was the marquee ritual that was used. He was symbolized as a bull, or certainly as a minotaur-like figure, man's body with a bull's head. That's parallel to Sikkuth. Sikkuth is an Assyrian name. Kion is then a Babylonian name. Okay, so in the Old Testament reference back in Amos, Sikkuth is an Assyrian word. It's an Assyrian name, and Kion is a Babylonian name. Right, so two pagan contexts. There's one commonality between all these elements as well. Again, Rephan being a translation of being a translation and then an adaptation from the Greek into what was ultimately Kion. One commonality that exists between those, and this is kind of the linchpin, is that Sikkuth to the Assyrians, Kion to the Babylonians, and then these references of Moloch and Rephan, certainly Rephan, which you could also say Remphan or Riphan. They were associated. Moloch's a bit of a different question, but because we're not quite sure, but he certainly could have been. So there's not much written about him. Certainly these three, though, the one common denominator is they were all astrologically associated with Saturn, as in the planet Saturn. Now, what is the significance of that? This is why you get a reference in again. Amos 5 says, Kion, your star god. Acts 7, when when Stephen is speaking in verse 42, right? And God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven meaning the stars. Saturn is a Latin name, right? Saturn was, or Saturnalia, Saturn was the Roman equivalent of the Greek god Kronos. It's where we get the word chronology. Kronos was the god of other things, but mainly time. It's where like chronography, right, in the study of watches, or chronologically, right, something about the ordering of time comes from the Greek word chronos. Ancestor of and father of many of the Greek gods that people are more familiar with, like Zeus and Poseidon and Athena, after which Athens is named, right? Because in all these pagan religions, be it Egyptian, Babylonian, Syrian, Greek, Roman, Canaanite, but to a lesser degree, so Phoenician in other words, there's always generations of gods, right? There's gods that beget other gods, and there's usually at the maximum 3 generations of gods. There's these primordial gods that were kind of the formative elements of the world, right? The sky and the earth and other things like that. There's then a second generation that comes along, which is then born of those elements, of those gods, which are more, they're still abstract but more concrete, like chronos, time, and various other things like that. And then there is a third generation, which is born of them, which are much more human-like. They're much more anthropomorphic, right? Like in Greek mythology, Zeus and Poseidon and Hades and Athena and Aphrodite and Apollo and Artemis and so on. You get that consistently. That was the case in Egypt, which is this context here, right? The equivalent of who they're worshipping in this context was an Egyptian god known as Geb, G-E-B. He was the god that was equated with Kronos to the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans. God of various different things, one of which, of course, was time. Also god of agriculture and of the earth, particularly the earth. But the point being here, and I think this is why this gets referenced, and I think this is why this was the case. We're not told this is just logical inference on my part theologically. The whole purpose for them going back and worshipping Egyptian gods was that, what we mentioned earlier, that familiarity, that sense of comfort, that sense of security. And what better way to do that than in worshipping one of the older gods, one of the oldest gods of Egypt, one of the oldest gods. They weren't just merely worshipping even more prominent gods like Osiris, which was that kind of third generation down here. And Egyptians actually had 4 generations, but anyway, it wasn't one of those third generations, right? Osiris is the equivalent of Zeus to the Greeks. They were going back through the generations of gods and going back to older gods. In this case, Geb was actually was held to be the first divine king of Egypt. So what they're doing here is again, this comfort and security, they're abandoning this new God, I'm saying that in inverted commas, right? But this new God, Yahweh, right? And they're going way back in worship. They're worshipping a deity from way, way, way back, right? Ancient even to them, which is saying something. Ancient even to people in 1500 BC, right? Because of that sense of comfort, of security, right? Of ease of worship, right? And going back to that which is familiar. And what better person to do that with, what better deity to do that with than the first divine king of Egypt himself? Pernicious, right? Wicked. such is the human condition. So all these names are equivalents of each other, broadly speaking, right?
I've seen the planet Saturn through a telescope, like a home, a good quality telescope.
Same, yeah.
But it was relatively easy to find with computerized, what do we call them? The metrics, sky metrics. Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Astrometrics and stuff.
Yeah, but it was very, very small.
It is, yes.
Very small. Even though this was a high quality telescope, the planet itself was very small, and you really had to peer into the eyepiece and squint, because there was a lot of atmospheric glare.
True.
So you had to squint to determine the rings from the actual
exactly, yeah.
planet.
They're not easy to pick up.
Okay, so if I had such great trouble with such high quality equipment, how did they even know Saturn existed?
No, they did at that point, yeah.
How?
Because the one thing the ancients were very good at was astronomy, right? So obviously there's astrology and astronomy. Astrology is all the religious element, and the zodiac. Astronomy is actually just the measuring and the astronomic measurements of the stars and everything else.
Clear as skies back then too.
That's also an element, definitely, yeah, true. But also just they had very good mathematics.
You can't see with the naked eye. You can't see Saturn with the naked eye. How did they know? And where to look?
Yeah. So part of it was
Joel. Sure.
And so it's a basically the way, this is a massive simplification for time. Everything in the heavens was considered a star. They were just considered different types of stars. You had basically the moving stars, right? The moving stars were the planets. So the ancients didn't know about the planet we refer to today as Uranus, right? So which is at the furthest extent in our solar system. Again, that concept of the god Uranus is the father of Kronos in Greek mythology. Kronos, the father of Zeus, whose Roman equivalent is Jupiter. Okay, so the planets are named. So that's why it goes in that order, right? So that's why it's Jupiter in our terminology: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, because that's actually the three generations of the Greek gods. They didn't know about Uranus, but they did know the furthest extent they knew was about Saturn. And again, that's what you're right, no, John. That's why it's the furthest out, right? Also, again, fitting into the mythology of the fact that Saturn, that Saturn is ringed, right? Has a ring around it. Is in that mythology, Saturn, or in his Greek name Kronos, was imprisoned by Zeus. All good? Yeah. Was imprisoned by Zeus in Tartarus, and so that ring around is held like at the prison. It's all how the mythology ties into each other. Anyway, they were very good at astronomy.
Amazing.
Impeccably good at astronomy. Again, like the pyramids of Giza are astronomically aligned with Orion.
Jaw-dropping.
And it's not, to the point. Khufu, the Great Pyramid, is geologically aligned with true north. Like not magnetic north. So magnetic north, you go, okay, they built a compass, use magnetism. No, true north, as in literally you go up the earth to the proverbial North Pole, plonk. So how did they know that?
It's even spookier than that. I forget the maths, but what is it? The moon is 40 times. No, I've got the maths wrong, but it's based on 40 and 400. The distance. If the moon, I think the moon is. No, I can't remember the.
That's right. Go home and remember and come back next time.
The connections. But if the moon were any smaller or larger, we could never have a lunar eclipse.
Correct, yes. That's true, yeah.
But the pyramid is also, it's got this, the base of the pyramid, the dimensions, is based on this 40-400 proportion. It
comes out when you actually take the dimensions of the base of the Great Pyramid. multiply it through different numbers, and I won't get into it now because it would take far too long to explain, but you end up actually coming right on top of the circumference of the earth. Yeah.
They were clever in those days.
Yes.
They
weren't dumb.
Yeah, exactly.
and they had clear skies and they had no light
Exactly right.
pollution.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the one reason why they'd figured it...
They worship the creation rather than the
Creator, yeah, exactly. And that's why a lot of that ties in religiously.
That's where they failed.
Yeah, correct. Exactly right, yeah. And again, you also have to keep
The
it...
more they learned about creation, the more it became the God.
Exactly, and the gods are always tied into that which has been made. Again, it's always the god of this, the god of that, the god of yada, 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 yada.
Well, I'm going to suggest something that some Christian preachers have dared suggest.
Sure, go ahead.
Dear
Go ahead, yeah.
No man received the mathematical exactitude to create
I agree.
and place the pyramids.
Correct.
No man had that knowledge.
No, I agree. 100%.
Or woke up one morning with that
No, I agree.
knowledge by himself.
No, I agree.
By himself.
No, I agree.
The-
No, I
no,
agree.
no. In a way,
Well, it was God's given.
it was God's given.
Yeah.
They received that information and then built the pyramids by and through the Nephilim.
Of course.
I would agree. Yeah, I have. There's just no world in which I'm ever going to believe that the Egyptians ever travelled to the North Pole to figure that out.
Yeah.
You're not going to convince me of that. There's no. Apart from the fact there's no evidence. It's just ludicrous to think. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing with paganism. That's the thing is it's not. Christians can't and shouldn't fall into the trap either, because again, it is a modernist trap of thinking. It's atheism light, L-I-T-E, of thinking that even though we are told that, and we're literally told, like in these pretty much exact terms, that there is only one God, there are no other gods. In the sense that they're actually gods, in the sense that they are actually divine, right? There are no other gods, okay? So we're not what's called, well, it goes by different names, but we're not what's called henotheists. Henotheism meaning we believe that there are many gods, just that our God is superior to those gods, right? So that's what henotheism means. Yes, other gods exist. So, like, yes, Zeus exists. Yes, Odin and Thor to the Norse and the Vikings. Yes, but Yahweh is greater and more powerful than all that. That's not what's presented. There is only one God, right? I am God. There is no other, right? So that's fundamentally true. Okay, we are strictly monotheists. There is actually, in reality, only one God. At the exact same time, the scriptures very clearly present to you that there are very real powers which do very much present as gods, which have very much been worshipped as gods, lowercase g, and who are very real and have very real powers, and are not to be trifled with. You may recall, I think it's in Acts. I'm pretty sure it comes up in Acts. It 100% comes up in the New Testament. It either comes up in Ephesians or in Acts, where Paul is John and the apostles, others of the apostles are dealing with, in Ephesus, are dealing with the woman, the prophetess, who's referred to as, and dealing with, and this is the Son of God and all this stuff, and she's heckling and going on in that fashion, and is referred to as, with the spirit of Python leaving her. It was referred to as a python. Do you recall that? I'm going to get the exact chapter up so I know exactly. So I can actually...
So they're all part of the kingdom of wickedness, right?
Yeah.
Correct, yes.
Very real.
Acts 16, I think it is. Let me go and have a look.
So the fallen angels that came with Satan.
Correct, yes. Who we refer to by other terms such as demon. The term demon coming from the Greek daemon, which was just a generic term which meant deity, essentially. So even the term demon ultimately comes from a Greek term daemon, if you want to think of it in English, D-A-E-M-O-N, daemon, which just was a generic term for deity. Acts 16, let me have a look here. Okay. assuming I've got the right chapter. Lydia, no.
About the whole armour of God about principalities.
Yeah. By the book of Acts 16. Acts 16, verse 16. Yeah, bingo, it is. Okay, sick. In Acts 16, Acts chapter 16. This man served the Most High God. Sorry, the guy this sees. Again, it's gone. So I'm just reading through it now. Verse 16, yeah. So in Acts chapter 16, verse 16 through 18, depends what translation you have as to the best translation. I'll explain to you what it says in the Greek though. So verse 16 of Acts chapter 16, as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination and brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. All right, that's the important verse here. Spirit of divination, does anyone else have anything different?
No, it says divination.
Yeah, fair enough. That's just probably done to simplify things, and that's fair enough. The Greek there, and I'm going to check exactly, I know what it says, I just need to check exactly. Yeah, it is. Yeah, pneumapithona. Pneumapithona, spirit of Python. What on earth does that mean? So the word you're actually getting translated as divination is pithona. Python. Python, which is where we get that term for a certain species of snakes called pythons. Python in ancient Greece was actually it's a demiurge, but it's a spirit. Python, which is where that term comes from. Where that ends up tying in is that in Greek mythology, Apollo, one of the most important of the Greek gods, at Delphi, which is in mid-Greece, it's about an hour and a half west of Athens. Delphi was the most religious centre of all Greece. The temple of Apollo at Delphi was the centre of religion, and the single most important religious figure in all of Greece was a prophetess known as the Pythia, which is the feminine name for Python. The mythology was that Python, the serpent spirit, ruled there in Delphi. Apollo then slayed Python, conquered Python, and established his temple there. The prophetess who had worked for Python and who was the mouthpiece for the spirit Python then became the mouthpiece for Apollo, kept the name Pythia, and she was the most important religious figure. All of that tying in, why did I bring that up? What you have here is a priestess of Python, is a priestess of Apollo. Python and Apollo were now tied at this point. They were one and the same in terms of the reference. This girl here is a prophetess, is a priestess of Python. Right? Does this text at all, and I'll just read it through again, as we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a slave girl who had a spirit of divination. In other words, a spirit of Python. She probably actually maybe worked for the Pythia. There were many people around. They weren't all at Delphi, right? There were plenty of temples of Apollo, but she was very much tied to the temple of Apollo. That's what the reference is meaning there. She was a prophetess of Apollo, right? And what did she do? She brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. She followed Paul and us, crying out, "These men are servants of the Most High God, who proclaims to you the way of salvation." Again, she's mocking. Saying the truth, but in a mocking fashion. And this she kept doing for many days. Paul, having become greatly annoyed, for obvious reasons, turned and said to the spirit, notice he didn't say to the girl, he said to the spirit in the girl, "I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." And it came out that very hour. In other words, it came out. But notice what's going on there. In verse 16, she brought her owners much gain by fortune telling. This was not just hocus pocus. No, this was real. She really did this stuff. And she very rarely did things. She very rarely had visions. She very rarely gave prophecies that very much came true. and she had power that really did things. It's not the infinite list of prohibitions in Deuteronomy and Leviticus alone, let alone anywhere else, against engagements in witchcraft, sorcery, necromancy, go down the line, divination, is not only, at a baseline level it is, but it is not only a matter of idolatry. Like that's the foundation, but it's not like it's just idolatry and that's the only problem with this. No. You are very really engaging with some very real things which will mess you up. 6 ways to Sunday. These are not powers to be trifled with. You are nothing compared to these things. Like, you're nothing. That's the point of it. It's not just merely a matter of religious worship. It is that, plus actually saving you from being destroyed, because these things are so far and beyond your powers, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself.
And that's why the Holy Spirit has to come.
Exactly.
Correct.
There's only one Holy Spirit.
Exactly right, 100%. That's why I say it again, it's not like, ancient Greece for me is kind of is one of my wheelhouses in terms of history. I 100%, and people in my theology, I 100% believe that the Pythia, right, the definitive article priestess of Apollo, the most important religious figure, I 100% believe that she gave prophecies. 100%.
Oh, yeah.
I absolutely believe that she said things which did come true. 100%. There's no reason to think that. There's no reason to think that that was all just some magic hocus pocus, and somehow not a single Greek caught onto it. Like, you know what I mean? It wasn't just some, puppet show. Like, it was like, no, like 100% that happened. Absolutely. The Pythia is told as, I'll go on and think, one of the most famous encounters of the Pythia is during the second Persian invasion of Greece. Leonidas I, the king of Sparta, before undergoing his march from Sparta all the way up to north of Athens, where he would eventually meet the Persian army under Xerxes, to fight them at this famous battle of Thermopylae, as it's referred to, right, the 300 Spartans. That was 480 BC. He consulted the Pythia. He went to Delphi by himself and consulted the Pythia for permission to go to war with Persia. Why? Because it was during the middle of one of the Pan-Hellenic Games, right? So the Greeks had the Olympics, which is where that comes from. They also had 3 other games. One of them was at Delphi, by the way. Those were not just athletic events, but they were also religious. Nothing was separated from the religious, right? So 10,000 of the Spartan warriors were already off at the games, and you couldn't go to war under Spartan law during those games. Leonidas realised, well, it doesn't matter because Persia's wiping their way down the Greek coastline, conquering everyone in their sight. We don't have time to wait. He goes and consults the Pythia, who says to him, you shall not go to war. If you do, you will all die. Right? And Persia will march onward. Right? He defies that order, goes to battle against them anyway. Well, they all die.
Yeah, of course.
Right? Now, eventually, though, their sacrifice rallied the Greeks, and they ended up defeating the Persians. They had the famous Battle of Salamis, massive naval battle, and you ended up defeating and driving out the Persians. But the Pythia was 100% correct. Like, she prophesied that accurately, because they all died. Not one of them. He sent back a small contingent of the Spartans, one of his captains mainly, to go back to Sparta to be able to tell them what had happened, to try and rally people to fight Persia. Everyone else, including Leonidas, died. They were all wiped out. Right? Is that just magic? She just happened to get it right? And she picked it to a T.
So how mad that he went to get her advice and then didn't follow it?
Well, because he knew because he was following Greek protocol of going and consulting the Pythia. But he realised, because again he's a warrior king, he realised we have to go out and fight the Persians. We can't sit around waiting for the games to end, because that's weeks away. They will have conquered Athens by that point, right? So it was a sacrifice on his part. But anyway, there's such a countless list of examples of the Pythia and other prophetesses and prophets 100% getting things right. Because they are being legitimately fed very real information by very, very real powers, who half the time are the ones who are actually doing the stuff, right? It's those demonic forces which are actually the ones doing the very things that they're prophesying about. So of course they know how it's going to go down. That's why we're not to trifle with it.
It does beg the question, how do forces of darkness know the future?
Yeah, good question. They're not omniscient. They're never presented as omniscient. The one who we refer to by many names, Satan, Lucifer, different languages, different names, is not omniscient. Right? He's not all-knowing. He's never presented as all-knowing. He's very knowing. And a large contingent of that would be dependent upon the actual power to enact it. Especially in that ancient context, where in ancient times they had so much, not in the literal sense free reign, but so much reign, right? Where the light of God, again, he was still sovereign, but the light of God in terms of redeemed people was this tiny little nation in this tiny, by relative terms, this tiny plot of land. Everything else was darkness, even in continents that they hadn't otherwise known of, like North America, South America, Australia, right? Darkness. Nothing. Everything else, darkness. Everything else was in darkness, right? That's why then Isaiah says that those who once resided, he says it, and it's also then quoted again in the Gospels by Luke and others, those who once resided in great darkness, upon them light has now dawned, right? And you then have Christ coming, the inauguration of the kingdom, you have the Great Commission, and then bam, whammo, all these Gentiles start getting converted, right? Right? And it goes all across the world from there, right? That obviously ties into other themes, but that's another story. And so that's where that element comes in. Like we've referenced before, right? You've got the Prince of Greece, the Prince of Persia, not just mere references to actual physical princes, referring to the powers behind the princes, behind the Prince of Persia, behind the Prince of Greece, etc.
Clearly and biblically, those forces of darkness, whoever they are, do know things. They know information and they know the future. Not always and not 100%, but enough for this girl to have brought her handlers a lot of profit.
Correct, yes.
Okay, so we know that. But as Christians, we must remind ourselves that the Lord is over it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he probably, just in a broad sense, gives the information to these, or allows the evil spirits to then communicate with humans, because what are the humans doing? What are they doing? They're consulting divinators.
Yes.
They're consulting tarot cards. They're being given over to their
That's what it means.
lusts.
That's why I'm bringing all this up, because that's what's tying into that language that Stephen uses, right? Which is not unique. Again, to use ad infinitum, right? God, in one phraseology or another, to that effect, God turning away and giving them over to X, Y, Z, whatever it is. Right?
And we have to be very careful as Christians, because I've been to Christian homes where, and these are Bible-believing Christians, who are still holding dear possessions which they ought not to hold dear.
Yep.
And I'm talking about things that are
100%.
innocuous, like books.
No, I know, yeah.
They've got books on subject matter which they ought not to. They should either burn or throw in the bin.
Exactly, because especially in those contexts where it's not books that they've acquired in order to. When I say learn, what I mean is I don't mean learn the secrets of. I mean know thy enemy type of deal. That's one thing. If it's books they've kept because that's what they used to be into, you got a problem on your hands.
It's a problem. It's not only books. It's music.
Oh yeah.
It's some music, CDs, records.
There's all kinds of
tapes,
things.
Of the wrong music. There's a lot of wrong music. It's satanically inspired, and these Christians are ignorant. It's stuff. I've been to Christian homes where there are African or tribal objects.
Yeah, art. Yeah.
And
like masks and weapons.
Masks, lamps.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Lamp bases, you name it. These things carry spirits.
Can do. Got to be careful.
There's a whole list. There's clothing. Yeah. Look, Achan kept clothing.
Yeah.
It was accursed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
We have to be extremely careful, and we don't get tuition, guidance, education on this as Christians.
Exactly. Oh, you go and then I'll go. Yeah.
The thing that came to me when you were saying all that stuff was in Ephesians about the whole armour of God.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
And but the verse that is actually the Ephesians, how I see it, is that Ephesians is actually for the church. It was really like for the church.
Yeah, very much so.
And for everyone to like take note.
Absolutely.
And right at the end, it's in chapter 6 about being strong in the Lord, and it says, put on the whole armour of God.
Yeah.
To be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. But the key verse, is actually just before it tells you about putting the armour of God. It says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Yeah, exactly. So that's actually a key verse too.
Absolutely, yeah, exactly.
In terms of turning it around, what you said,
exactly.
That's what I would say.
No, you're 100% right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's and what those that armor, again, an understanding of why the different items that are listed in the armor requires a bit of martial knowledge. That requires some knowledge of what. Be interesting to hear series to do actually one time. But anyway, that's that whole premise. Because again, it's not you are. Well, like it said in Job chapter 7, the life of man on earth. So the life of man on earth is warfare. Yes. That's a very literal translation of that verse. Most of your translations wouldn't put it that way, but it's a very literal translation. The life of man on earth is warfare. What we do is engage in battle. Again, people don't. We'd be very shocked at how often we think in modern secular atheistic terms. What we do here on a Sunday morning is war. It really is. It's spiritual war. Absolutely. Right? We assemble as the battle army of God, and we gather in one place to in public, on a day that's referred to as the Lord's Day, to worship Him in public with singing aloud, not hidden away. We do that publicly. Right? That is warfare. What we're doing is we're gathering in this place, in this township, and declaring the praises of the Most High. Absolutely. Right? It's not. It seems over the top, but it's not. And the scriptures describe it in that fashion, right? On a similar yet different level. And I said this point blank to Joshua and Fiona. That wedding is a testimony to the glory of God. Absolutely. And it's an act of war.
That's wonderful.
That is an act of war on our part. Absolutely. Where we are ringing those bells, we are blaring that organ, and we are letting everyone know that two people are getting married in accordance with God's holy law in the sight of God, and that God is with us. Right? It's not melodramatic. It's exactly how the scriptures present these things. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, even though on the surface level you actually are. Right? It's really like we've not only against, but also on the deeper level against principalities and powers and the actual forces behind, the forces behind, right? It's not just physical, it's the spiritual element as well, right? It's not an either or, it's a both end. And that's how it's to be understood. That's why that imagery that you just read out correctly of the armour of God is presented in that kind of exact fashion, right? What we do here is warfare. When we pray, warfare. When Michael does those corporate prayers, which he and I very carefully constructed with a lot of purpose, and a lot of people may not realise the structure. But, we begin with an adoration, we move into a confession of sin, which is a very important part of for a congregation to do. We then offer a thanksgiving, and then finish up essentially after that thanksgiving with basically asking for this, asking for that, which is perfectly fine to do, right? And so we move into that supplication after our thanksgiving, right? It's structured that way for a reason, and it's one of the most important things we do in that service, right? It's lengthy because we're talking to God. It's lengthy because there's a lot to pray about, right? Martin Luther once said that when I get, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said that on the days when I'm most busiest, I make sure that I begin my day with 3 hours of prayer, right? When I have a lot to do, right? Which seems counterintuitive, but the point is it seems counterintuitive to go, but hold on, you're pressed for time. Yeah, but that's why. So I'm so pressed for time and so stressed out with all this and this and this and this. I need to begin with hours of prayer, right? For that kind of reason. So anyway, that's where we are. So that finishes up that, right? A lot of stuff in there. Again, history and other important elements that you've hopefully found useful. Again, next session will cover from 44 to 53 and those verses therein. And that'll then finish this famous speech on the part of Stephen, 44 to 53. And then the session after the next one will finish off the chapter, verses 54 to 60. So, any final questions or comments?
The Lord our God is one God, and beside him there is no other.
That's right.
That's the one.
And you think of what the devil came in and did in the Garden of Eden, and sometimes it's just dealt with quite lightly. We have now experienced some of what he's caused through all you've said today.
Exactly.
And it's still going on. It started then and it's...
Yeah. But we're winning.
Yes,
and I would argue...
We're on the victory side.
That's the one. You go and then I'll just finish up one final
When
thing.
we were reading from Amos, my chapter heading for chapter 5 said lamentation for Israel or against Israel.
Yeah, that's basically what that chapter's about, yeah.
And I never thought of this before, but all those replacement theologist Christians who think that the church has replaced Israel,
True.
I wonder if they accept the lamentation against Israel.
True. I mean, yeah.
In other words, they count the blessings, but they refuse the curses.
Correct. Yeah, and I try and exactly right. I know, and I try and point that out exactly. I mean, those who hold to a really kind of strict replacement theology are few and far between in terms of their numbers. And again, people.
That's not true.
Proportion.
I don't believe that.
Fair enough. Proportionally, I would argue that.
When they hear the truth, they change.
I would argue proportionally they are, but either way, that's just semantics. The even as, and again, people know my eschatological position, but even at a baseline level, it's not the case that, again, that's what I'm saying, even when you bifurcate church in Israel, no matter what way you do it, either doing it through a replacement theology or doing it through a really kind of really hardline dispensational view, a bifurcation of church and Israel is just not what's necessarily presented there. Again, because you can't account for why you have references to the Old Testament saints as church or as ecclesia. When you get that imagery in Romans chapter 11, again, which there are varying opinions about, but no matter what you want to talk about in Romans chapter 11, there's not two trees. Right? There's only one tree, right? There's one tree, right? Branches of that tree were cut off. Branches of that tree have been grafted in. There's still only one tree though, right? So that's why, again, every one of them here that we're reading about with the apostles and everything else, right, and all the authors of the New Testament didn't consider themselves to be something new or different, right? Otherwise, this whole speech for starters makes no sense because this is all references back to history. Well, if that history had been cut off and replaced, that makes heads and tails of this entire point of all this stuff. It makes heads and tails of the times where, say, Paul gives reference to Timothy about how he has believed the scriptures from a young age and taught by his mother and grandmother. Well, what were those scriptures? It wasn't the New Testament because they hadn't been written yet, or that was being written, right? It hasn't been completed. It was it would have been Greek for him, but it's the Old Testament, right? It's the Old Testament. The New Covenant does not destroy or do away with it completes. It's the capstone. That's how it's meant to should be viewed. That's how it's presented, certainly. And there is one tree, There's not two trees. There's not church and Israel, as if they're different elements. There's one tree. That's what's presented in Romans 11. Again, there are different opinions of that. It ties into eschatology, it ties into a bunch of other subjects. But either way, there is still only one tree presented. And where people line up that, there's obviously a spectrum in that zone of one tree and what that means, but that's a debate for another day. So, yeah. Yes, so I'll leave it at that.
I mean, not surprisingly, when we read Scripture, it's very difficult to keep to one subject because Scripture is so amazingly multi-layered.
Yeah, it's like that graph I showed you one time with that rainbow arc of all the different cross references to every other place,
It's
and
amazing.
and it's just this one continuous rainbow stream from Old through to New Testament, just virtually every book.
And yet we're
There's
assailed,
nothing like it.
And yet we're assailed more and more, and the children are assailed more and more with just this skim coating of the secularists, even the secular Bible scholars, who say, there are all these contradictions in the Bible, or, historically it's wrong.
Yeah, I know. But that's
It's ignorant to say all those things.
Yeah, well, it's not only ignorance. It doesn't really take. It doesn't take long to figure out that it's kind of, a lot of scholars trying to find answers to these questions is just about what you would expect when asking a criminal to go and find the police. Like, it's kind of antithetical to their very purpose of being, right? Why on earth they're not Christians and they don't believe.
No.
Why on earth? Well, it's not even a question of can seeing it. They don't want to. Why on earth would they ever? Why would you expect them to come saying? It's like they're literally not worth listening to at all, because they're the definition of a biased source. As if you would ever expect them to find legitimate answers to it when they're not looking for them in the first place. Goes completely against the Bart Ehrmans of the world, or other non-Christian biblical scholars who are not Christians. Expecting them to come up with any other answer is the definition of insanity. Like, why on earth would they come up? It would be like expecting me to come up with answers demonstrating to you why the Quran is correct. Well, of course I'm not going to. Right? Now, I would like to hold that I have a level of objectivity that if in some parallel universe there was actually consistent truth to be found in the Quran, I would actually do that. But we're so far beyond the limb of hypothetical, what's the point? Expecting these people to give you any other answer other than it's filled with errors and contradictions. Well, of course they would say that, because they have no reason to believe it. Just for themselves. Yeah. Anyway, so there we go.